Hello, Rohan. It's indeed a
Hey.
pleasure to be with you.
Nice.
And we are here on account of the International Biological Diversity Day. This year's slogan is "Be part of the plan." I guess they are referring to the post-2020 biodiversity framework, which applies to the whole world.
Sure.
But we are a biodiversity hotspot, and we have a very rich biodiversity, and we do need a plan as to how to go about keeping it that way. So I think what I would like to start off by saying, what is it that we need to do to ensure that our rich biodiversity stay as it is, at least for the next few decades. I think thinking beyond that is a little difficult in a turbulent world, but at least for the next 4 or 5 decades, what can we do, or what do we have to do?
So I think, Devaka, the thing is to start with what are the threats that we face going forward that our biodiversity faces. If you separate biodiversity into species, landscapes, ecosystems, for example, how do we make sure that those persist into the forthcoming decades, as you say? I think we have a fairly good assessment of where we stand as far as biodiversity is concerned, because, for example, you've been leading the red listing process for the past couple of decades, and we have a really good picture of what the threatened species in this country are. There are a lot of threatened species. I think your assessment of the flora, for example, discovered that almost 50%, 48% of flowering plants are now threatened. But there's also good news there, that the number of extinctions has been relatively small. And some species that we thought were extinct have been rediscovered recently by people like Dr. Himesh Jayasinghe, for example. So there's also some good news in there. But our problem is that when we recognize species as being threatened through the red listing process, it stops there. Our job then is to have a recovery plan for each of those species that tells us, how do you stop that species from being threatened? Ideally, we should work to get them off your list so that they are no longer threatened. So our challenge, I think, is to look at least some examples of species that are critically endangered and how we can rescue them. Now, again, there's good news. The Wildlife Department, for example, has been working on species like the Asoka barb, this species that is found only around Kitulgala and Dharaniyagala. And they're working with the local school children, for example. This is a wonderful reach-out project to assure the conservation of that species. You yourself, I know from the last 10 years or so, have been working with the Bandula barb in another village. This is a little fish that is restricted to just one little village near Galapita in the Kerala district, I think. And here, again, the local people are leading the conservation effort. So we've got like really good examples of where conservation is working. Our challenge now is to broad base those and to make sure that projects like that can be worked across the landscape and not just in isolation as they are now. So I think that is one. But the biggest challenge we face, especially since we know that climate is warming in Sri Lanka progressively. When climate warms, species that live in a given altitude would tend to want to migrate upwards. When I say migrate, I don't mean that an individual frog or bird will want to fly into a higher altitude. But with the passage of time, their seeds will prefer to or do better if they grow at a higher altitude, and so there will be upward migration. Now, the problem we have is that our landscape is very fragmented, especially in the wet zone. Our forests are all in the form of islands, whether you look at Singaraja, Kanneliya, Kottava, Hiniduma, Nakyadeniya, Haycock. These are all little fragments of forests scattered around in the ocean of humanity in the wet zone. So these species can't migrate to more appropriate habitats as climate changes. So the big challenge, I think, that we have looking to the future is to try to establish those kinds of the kind of connectivity that we need between habitats to ensure that such migration can take place. I know I'm going on, but I'm going to go on for 1 minute now.
That's good.
We have an opportunity here. If you think about it, pretty much all of Sri Lanka's rivers descend from the highlands to the lowlands and then to the sea. So these are transects, like up-down transects, and we have 103 river basins in this country. Every single river, by law, has a reservation on either side in which you can't do development. And this is a lovely opportunity for us to start reforesting and building forest corridors on river margins, riparian vegetation, from the highlands, from Horton Plains, down to the south through the Vallabha Basin, down to the west through the Kalani Basin, to the northeast through the Mahavali Basin, and so on. So we've got the opportunity to make biodiversity highways that traverse the various altitudes of Sri Lanka. The point is, now we have to plan and do that.
I think you really touched a very important thing because this whole idea of connectivity has been going on for a couple of decades now. We've tried to look at landscapes that can create this permeability matrix, because when you look at the wedge zone, I think the first point you raised, the threatened species, nearly 75 to 80% are in the wedge zone. And that brings to the second point which you made, most of the natural habitats are fragmented, which brings to the third issue is connectivity.
Exactly.
And you have exactly identified what we have to do. But,
and hang on, let me say, and you have shown the way it can be done. We shouldn't be a talk fest between us about our mutual achievements, but the fact is, the project you did with Biodiversity Sri Lanka, I think over the last 6 years at Kanneliya, relatively small project, 25 hectares, I think, but a fantastic example of how quickly you can achieve a restored habitat so that the nature takes care of the rest. Basically, you get it started and then it carries on remorselessly. How did you achieve that, and what kind of money did you spend on doing that relatively small project?
Roughly about 1 million a hectare. The problem we faced there was it was not like a regular replantation project where you plant and then you leave it as it is. We realized that's not going to work, because in that particular site, Forest Department has tried it twice and failed, because just plant and exit approach doesn't work. So we had to stay in the site and we had to put additional reinforcements to prevent herbivores from coming in, prevent forest fires. That added up to the base price, because I think when you look at a lot of these reforestation projects, the base price they quote is fairly low compared to us, because that monitoring and maintenance part is not included. But the problem we have identified is, if you don't include that, if you don't have the maintenance part, within few years you're going to come back to point zero. And if you do not monitor, you do not know whether you're heading in the right direction. But those things add up to the price, and that is what makes it a little difficult for us to sell this idea.
But hang on. 1 million a hectare is 20% of the cost of planting a hectare of tea. This is a very reasonable price by any yardstick. In the Sri Lankan context, 1 million a hectare is a very reasonable price to get this ball rolling, because remember, you don't have to spend that year on year. This is a one-time cost that you pay. And then for the rest of eternity, that habitat will take care of itself, right? Once you get it.
After about 10 years, it should take care of itself. So that is the lesson we learned. But now that you have raised a very important point about using the river network for connectivity, this is again something that we tried, but when you have to do it in a smallholder dominated landscape, you have to bring in a lot of people onto the negotiation table to establish that, unless we implement the law, which is what you said, that there are specified reservations which are not honored at the moment. So if you are strictly implementing the law and acquire those lands and start replanting, that can be done. But I do not know how practical that is going to be, especially how people would respond to that. But one thing I've realized is this, in the wet zone, that the bigger landscape is dominated by tea and rubber. There are 60,000, close to 60,000 hectares of natural habitat within that landscape, and they are able to do it if they are given the proper incentives. Now, Jeff 7 investment
This
in
is Global
Sri
Environment Facility.
Global Environment Facility is going to invest $4 million. We already got the grant. And the grant is looking at uh, investing on the estate sector to do exactly this kind of thing. So what is your take on our ability to achieve this by bringing them as a part?
I think it's a fantastic opportunity. What I think we should have put in there is some requirement for matching funds from Sri Lanka. Because if we don't put money in, we have very little incentive to make sure it works in the long term. And the plantations, even though I take your point that in the smallholder environment, this would be difficult to do because it's a lot of stakeholders, 400,000 tea smallholders alone in Sri Lanka. So this is a big ask. In the estate sector, you just have 25 or so RPCs, these regional plantation companies. And these have already got existing management structures and organizations which can absorb additional supervisory capacity. So to work with them, I think would be a huge advantage. And especially in the highlands of Sri Lanka, which is the most vulnerable area, because warming in the highlands is much worse than in the lowlands, and also the highlands are drying quite fast. At Norelia, now it's unusual to get more than 1,500 millimeters of rain per year, whereas in 30, 40 years ago, you got 2,000 millimeters of rain per year. So rainfall has dropped by about 20% on average over the last century in the highlands of Sri Lanka. And this is a landscape on which we depend for hydropower, for irrigating the whole of the north central province, for urban water supply, and for rain-fed agriculture like tea. The whole tea landscape is a rain-fed landscape. And so building resilience into that, not just for agriculture, but also for biodiversity, I think is a very important thing. And an important part of that resilience is shade. If we don't put up woolly vegetation in these places, it's going to be difficult to do. And there again, we have the advantage, because now despite warming climate, the fact that there is much more CO2 in the air means that plants are growing a lot faster. As we are seeing on Houghton Plains, for example, with rhododendrons, it's coming up everywhere. So we have an opportunity that we can capitalize on. I feel that that's important to do. So what you mentioned about the Jeff aid, $4 million will go a long way in getting a lot done in the Sri Lankan context. What I'd like to see is more private sector companies getting engaged in this. Because already Biodiversity Sri Lanka, I think, has more than 20 corporates putting money into really good projects like your Karnelia project and various mangrove restoration projects which are being done. The thing now is to try and expand that, because even a few lakhs, which is like what the cost of an air ticket or something like that, which these guys are traveling huge amounts, put towards biodiversity can make a huge difference.
And you mentioned these matching funds. Global Environment Facility requires matching funds. Unfortunately, we have shown matching funds, but that's only on paper. One of the other options that we've been toying around for a while is payment for ecosystem services. If we do this, if we establish the forest reservations along the river network, I think the ecosystem services that we can get is very high. The issue with the only issue I see with the tea industry or the RPCs, their primary objective is not reforestation. Their primary objective is production. So if we are asking these guys to put aside certain amount of their land for establishing reservations, they should be getting some compensation for that. And what do you think about this concept of payment for ecosystem? For instance, water board. Can they put some money back into?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. So my statistics might be a little off, but I think in round numbers, the CEB generates about $300 million worth annually of hydropower. The water board sells water to the tune of about 1/5 of that. So altogether, close to $400 million worth of direct ecosystem benefits just from the rivers draining the highlands, from electricity and from water. If we put 2% of that aside, already you've got $6 million, which is more than what Jeff is putting in. And every year. And 2% on our electricity bill, I know electricity is expensive, but if you look at 2%, is not a big deal. It's a rounding error. And this could make a huge difference. And also remember that almost all of that money, that $6 million every year, converted into rupees, like 2 or 3 billion rupees, is money going in for labor. That's all the expenses. Yes. There's no technology, there's no land moving machinery. This is going into people's pockets. So it directly benefits all the communities who live on the riverside to do this. What's in it for the estates? I think a little coercion is not a bad idea to have, because estates, remember, their leases are coming up for renewal in 15 years from now. And at that point, I think we should give them targets. For every RPC should have any wasteland, unproductive land in its management orbit should be in developing forest. And we should give them a target for that, and maybe give them some funding for that or some benefit for that, because this is the way that we can get it done, and it's better for them as well. It's better for the brand of Ceylon tea, for example, to say that we are sequestering so much carbon and so much biodiversity. And so we need to turn this into a selling point. And the thing is, we can do that. If you look at countries like Costa Rica, their whole national brand is about biodiversity conservation, has been for the past 40 or 50 years. So it can be done in Sri Lanka. It's just that we have to have the will to do it.
So that is where I think we have the biggest obstacle. How do you think we can sell this to our governments and convince them to, part with the kind of money that you're talking about?
Government is not the place to do it. I think this has to be the private sector that does it. Government in Sri Lanka, like governments in most other developing countries, are a failure. They don't really pay attention to these problems. It's nothing to do with individual political parties. That is the nature of developing country government. They have bigger fish to fry. They're dealing with poverty, with education, health, budget deficits, all kinds of problems like this. And having to actually invest money in biodiversity is something they won't willingly do. This is not going to happen. We've got to tie it into actual money-making enterprises. For example, National Water Supply and Drainage Board, the regional plantation companies, the Central Electricity, the CEB, Ceylon Electricity Board. And we've got to tie them to targets to invest in the ecosystem services which they need. Because after all, Colombo's water supply is going to face a major threat from sea level rise. And because we get a substantial amount of our...
Already facing that.
Exactly. So this means doing some major civil engineering in the Kalani River, at the lower end of the Kalani River. This is going to cost a huge amount of money. But that is in effect preserving an ecosystem service. Yeah. So they have to invest in that. So these issues are going to come up, and they can only be paid for eventually by those enterprises and by us, the consumers. We have no choice but to pay for it. It's our country, it's our biodiversity, and there's nobody going to give us a free lunch. We have to do it ourselves. And it doesn't need a lot of money. It's very affordable. When you look at 2% of utility bills, this is not a big deal.
So basically proposing a free trade between CB, Water Board and RPCs. They pay the RPCs. They do the reforestation. So without the government coming in, will the policies, the current financial policies?
I can't see why not, because there's nothing stopping it. It can be like a credit system that we force landowners to buy. Every landowner has to buy a credit system if you've got more than, say, 5 acres or 10 acres. We have to look at what the sensible rate is. And in that case, you have to comply. There are many other rules with which landowners have to comply. For example, the Fragmentation Board oversees, and has for the last 50 or 60 years, overseen all land transactions. So we can make it a condition that you have to have a biodiversity certification, just like you get a coast conservation certification if you transact coastal land. This is not an impossible thing to require. That you look after land in your custody, because after all, that land is not yours to take away when you die. It's going to be here. It's going to be part of our country, and it has to provide the service for all of our people that we require of it.
Yeah, because that is the bigger issue we had when we did the Kandalia project. We worked out the science and the numbers, but upscale, I mean, it's a 12-hectare project. In terms of services, it's not going to do much. But if we can expand it to 1,000 hectares, 2,000 hectares, then only the services will come. Exactly. But who is going to pay for it was the question. Initially, we were lucky that the the companies came to our rescue and they footed the bill. But I think we need a much more sustainable system like what we've been discussing. So I think that's very hopeful that if we can get that sort of system going, where agencies like CB and Water Board paying the money and the RPs is doing it, would be the best solution we can think of. And this Jeff money can do the pilot work and do the necessary groundwork, which can be upscaled.
Sure.
Do you really think
I think the
that
private
we
sector can pull it off. And so the government agencies like CEB and NSW, these are civilized people. They've got lots of intellectual capacity. They can do it. I think you just need to lead them to the right place and they will do it for you. You have to get the Public Utilities Commission involved and look at how this will affect tariffs and so on. Of course, it's not like you can just sign a paper today and make a difference. But this is a situation which is negotiable in a fairly short time. I would say 3 or 4 months is all it takes of negotiating between these agencies. It will take probably leadership, maybe something like the Chamber of Commerce getting involved and forming a forum in which these discussions can take place, a system of certification so that we can give some kind of benefits to the companies that make the right investments, not necessarily financial benefits, but even social benefits that they will get from this. So I think it's eminently doable. But the bottom line is, I think when we started this conversation, we were feeling rather dismal. All these landscapes that are getting fragmented, the species that are threatened with extinction, and now, just swapping ideas, you can see that there is a realistic chance of saving the situation. This is not a hopeless case. We are in a really good place to make a palpable difference to biodiversity outcomes in Sri Lanka. It just takes a little wit and wisdom to get it done. Maybe the two of us should be put in charge, right?
That was the last question I was going to pose to you. Who should take the initiative if we are to pull this off?
I think we have a lot of young people who are really good in the corporate sector. Like in addition to Biodiversity Sri Lanka, which has got this group of corporates, the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society has now got this initiative called Plant, where they're taking over forest lands in various parts of the country and looking after it, and for all eternity, like trying to make a difference and to build corridors and so on. They're raising, again, on their own, millions of dollars as an NGO. There's no reason this can't be more widely replicated. And I think the one thing I would say about whoever leads the project they should be under 40, with lots of energy and the ability to run around and do things, because this is a project that we have to really think long term, and we need to train the people, get them exposure now, so that when we really do it at scale, we'll have experienced people who also have the energy and youth with which to deliver these outcomes.
So with that hopeful note, I think we can end this discussion. So
it's good that we're really both hopeful.
Yes. I think if you are going to be a conservation biologist, you have to have a lot of hope. So you're always fighting losing battles, or apparently that's what it looks like. But I think what this discussion shows is it's not all that bad. We still have time to make a change.
Sri Lanka is in a really good place, and things are not as bad as they often seem. If we keep at it, I think we can deliver. I mean, just quickly, we talked about threatened species. Out of our 30-something endemic birds in this country, not a single one is critically endangered. For example, that's a fantastic outcome. Like, so we're doing something right to make that happen.
That comes to a place like Indonesia.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So I think we are not in a bad place. Sri Lankans have got the intellectual capacity to deliver on this. We've got a government that doesn't get too much in the way. But I think citizens left to themselves, and if empowered, can really deliver fantastic outcomes for biodiversity.
Thank you, Rohan. It has always been a pleasure.
Me too. Thank you.